Alright, you guys, welcome back. Today's going to be our last day of the school year, which is, well, came by both quickly and slowly somehow. It's hard to believe it's already been like 10, 11 weeks of us being in lockdown. Um, but it is unfortunate that we unfortunately have to end on this note or ending the way that it is ending. I would have liked to spend more time with you guys in class, but hopefully next year things will be back to normal and you guys can drop by and say hello. So let's go ahead and get this done. Again, I would have normally spent much more time on the civil rights movement and really on all the other things we've covered since lockdown, right? World War II, the Cold War. The fact that we have 90 minutes of class a week makes it hard to really spend a lot of time going in depth. So, um, doing the best I can, given the time that we have. Today we'll kind of look at the end and the legacy of the civil rights movement, which I think is a very salient topic given current events right now in our country. And hopefully we'll kind of come to understand that, first of all, to see what kind of successes were won by the civil rights movement of the 1960s and what things were still not, I would argue, completed or fully realized. And then we'll look at other groups that also fought for civil rights during this time period and see what they were able to accomplish. Okay, so before we dive into other groups, let's talk about African Americans a little bit more. Now, it's important to note that while Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the most famous face of the civil rights movement and arguably the most successful leader of the civil rights movement, he was definitely not the only leader or the only option people had when finding ways to voice their opinion, to express their desire for change. There's two people that I would like to talk about really briefly. Number one is Marcus Garvey, seen here on the left. He was a Jamaican immigrant who later moved to the United States. He came a bit earlier than the Civil Rights Movement. He was active in the 20s through 40s, really. But a lot of people call him kind of the grandfather or the father, or whatever you want to call him, of the 1960s Civil Rights Movement because he was the first African American leader that was able to sort of gain a large following and use his following to push forth his agenda. He believed in black nationalism and pan-Africanism. These are ideas that African Americans deserve to have their own nation, and that black doesn't have to be Americans, right? Just people of African descent kind of have this shared culture, shared history, especially with the history of slavery, and that they deserve to have their own place, their own area in which they can kind of grow and prosper, and that there shouldn't be distinctions between different people that are of African descent, and that they are all, in fact, one, bonded by this shared culture and history. Okay, that's kind of Pan-Africanism. His big idea was to reverse the African diaspora and essentially bring African Americans back to Africa, where he felt they could prosper much more than they could in the U.S. in the New World at the time. He founded a cruise ship line, it's not really a cruise ship line, but a ship line called the Black Star Line, and his plan was to use these ships in order to bring people back to Africa. Now, he was very controversial at the time. Okay, Du Bois, who we've talked about a lot of times in our classes here, said Marcus Garvey is, without doubt, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. He's either a lunatic or a traitor. For Du Bois and for other African American leaders, Garvey was essentially saying, "Hey, we can't be treated as equals here, so we should just leave, right? And there's no point in fighting." To a certain degree, right? And that's how they viewed his argument. And so many people kind of disagreed with him and felt that no, we are African Americans, right? We are both African and American. Africa is not the place for us anymore. We just want equality and freedom in the place that we live, right? Because at this point, most African Americans had been in the U.S. since the time of slavery. In fact, much longer than many immigrants who came from European countries in the early 1900s, late 1800s, right? So in fact, you could even argue they were more American than many white people, right? On the flip side, Dr. King said that Garvey was the first man of color to lead and develop a mass movement. He was the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny and make the Negro feel he was somebody. So as you can see here, he was definitely a controversial figure to say the least, but he was able, like I said, kind of agreeing with Dr. King here, he was able to kind of start to push for this notion of a black leader and someone who could organize a movement for African Americans. Okay, he would eventually pass away in 1940 from 2 strokes. One of the sad stories about him is that he had a heart attack, and so the newspaper printed that he died broke, alone, and unpopular, even though he actually didn't die from that first heart attack. And so he got to read of his own death before it really happened, and then he later died from a second stroke. All right. Secondly, we have Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X was a member of the group called the Nation of Islam. And they promoted, instead of equality, black supremacy. So they were not with MLK's vision of an integrated society, right, of both sides coming together and everyone getting along. They said no, right? If people believe in white superiority, we believe in black superiority. And he was definitely a more aggressive leader than Dr. King. By advocating for the separation of black and white. He said basically, look, we can't get along, so we need to have our own communities and our own societies. Okay, and he rejected this notion of integration. Now, while his views may seem a little extreme on the surface, as being a little bit of a eye for an eye type of thing, of fighting, I won't say fighting racism with racism, but fighting, this idea of people not getting along with saying, yeah, we don't get along, so we're better, right, type of thing. But in fact, Malcolm X was very, very important to the movement. Okay, he emphasized, again, kind of like Marcus Garvey, Pan-Africanism, but also self-determination, right? This idea that African Americans need to fight for themselves and also decide their own leaders. Black self-defense. This is especially kind of relevant to today's world because one of the big Malcolm X notions was about police brutality, and that's saying that African Americans, or all brutality, not just police brutality, but any sort of lynching and violence from white Americans, that black Americans need to defend themselves, right, and protect themselves and not rely on the, at the time, mostly white police. For those who admired Malcolm X, they would argue that he stood up against white America for crimes against black Americans, whereas his critics would say that he preached racism and violence. Another important aspect of Malcolm X was this notion, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with the Black Panthers too, was this notion that he argued that black is beautiful, right? And basically made these statements about how you don't have to, if you're a black American, you don't have to change your appearance and change who you are to fit in, right? At the time, something very popular for African Americans to do was called conking their hair or just straightening their hair, which is basically trying to make their hair appear more quote-unquote white, if you will. And he basically said, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to change how you look to fit beauty standards for someone else. He argued that, hey, like, be who you are, act who you are, dress who you are, wear your hair the way it is, and that is what is beautiful, right? And so for many people, this was a very important step into kind of having a personal self-realization that you don't have to bend your appearance and your actions and the way you talk and the way you behave in order to fit someone else's idea of what is right and proper and beautiful. He was eventually assassinated in 1965 by another member of the Nation of Islam who felt that he had lost the message and become too soft, as opposed to the more hardline message of the group. And then finally, we have the Black Panthers. Okay, now the Black Panthers were not a person necessarily, but a group that was created in Oakland, California. So again, some local history here along with the history of the civil rights. The main leaders were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, but many other important leaders were there as well. And they were an activist group that preached black nationalism, kind of like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, but also this notion of socialism, that black communities need to come together and kind of create their own kind of systems, socialist systems, in order to support themselves, to provide services, to help each other out, so on and so forth. They took a more militant approach, and so one of their main things was arming citizens. And so in the streets of Oakland, where there's a lot of issues with police brutality of white cops on black citizens, they would patrol the streets with guns to monitor the behavior of police officers. Now, you can see here why this would, again, be a very controversial movement, especially given the time period. While, obviously, the ideas were good, and I think salient based on what was happening, you can see why some people, both black and white, would not necessarily be in accordance with their ideas. However, they did do a lot of very positive things for the community. They created free breakfast for children programs in Oakland, health clinics for African Americans, assistance to the homeless, things that essentially the government should have been doing, but the government wasn't doing for these people in these communities, these predominantly black communities, right? Even though the government is supposed to provide services for people, it wasn't doing that, at least not in the necessary level. And so groups like the Black Panthers emerged and essentially played the role of the government in many cases. Some view the party as the most influential black movement organization of the late 60s, whereas others view it as more of a criminal than political group. As you can see, this one has probably the most wide range of controversial takes on it, or kind of perspectives on it. A lot of that, I think, does have to do with, well, obviously race relations at the time were at an all-time high in tension, I would argue, right? But also, I think it's the fact that this is in the midst of the Cold War, and you have this group preaching socialism, and that was a very dirty word in American politics at the time. And in fact, the FBI took a very, very hard and some would argue excessive and unlawful approach in dismantling the Black Panthers. Many of the leaders were killed in essentially acts of police brutality, but many would argue it was planned. So last slide for now, we'll look at the end of the civil rights movement of the 60s. Now, it doesn't necessarily end, right? It's not like someone said, okay, we're done. But there was kind of a moment in the early to mid to late 60s, or kind of throughout the 60s, I guess, where life was more, or politics were more malleable or kind of changeable, right? We had things like the Vietnam War heating up. We had all these protests happening, the hippie movement. And so people were willing to accept change during this time. When things started to kind of cool down, people lost that kind of desire for change. But anyways, so we have the Selma marches as well as the March in Washington, which eventually pushed for positive legal change. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which eliminated literacy tests and poll taxes, right? So at the time, you would have to pass a test to show that you were literate to vote or to pay a tax to vote, both things that disproportionately affected Black Americans. And in 3 years, from 65 to 68, black voter registration went from 10% of the population to 60%. Now, while many say that it did not erase the many years of inequalities and the fact that we still have issues today, right? In 2020, we're still fighting racism and inequality, kind of, I think, adds to the argument that it didn't necessarily change things 100%. But as with any law, right, the law has to come first, and then people's minds have to be changed later, because people's minds change much more slowly than the law. So it did create some positive change, obviously, and it was a great victory. But at the same time, it wasn't job done. The problem was that many people saw it as a job done, especially people who weren't African Americans. A lot of white Americans said, okay, those who supported the movement, they're like, yay, we got it done. Voting Rights Act, we're done. Game over, right? But that wasn't the case. It wasn't done, right? It's easy to say it's over when the law is passed, just like slavery was ended in 1865. But the fact that we had another thing in 1965, 100 years later, shows that it doesn't just take the law to change for things to change. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee in April of 68, which essentially beheaded the leader of its movement. Which then kind of, I would argue, led to one of the reasons why there was a weakening of the movement after 1968, after those original accomplishments were made. There was a second Civil Rights Act passed in 1968, which provided equal housing regardless of race, creed, or national origin, trying to end discrimination in housing. Now, as we know, though, these things, right, discrimination in voting and in housing, are still real things even today. But these were very important steps in pushing for more equality. Okay, so before we dive into civil rights for other groups, I'd like you guys to, on your Google Doc, just you can either do a chart or a Venn diagram or just paragraphs, just compare and contrast the different civil rights movements. Okay, so compare and contrast Marcus Garvey's ideas, Malcolm X's ideas, the Black Panthers' ideas, and then Dr. King's ideas. Okay, just kind of in terms of what they wanted, what they did, and what their ultimate goal was. Okay, so do that and then tune into part 2.